Hey everyone. Thanks so much for joining me today. I hope you guys are all having a very pleasant afternoon. My name is Jenny Trulock. I am the programs manager here at the Homestead Museum, and I'm very excited to be talking about female justice today. This is a true crime case that we are going to be delving into. So the content might not be suitable, especially for younger viewers who might be within earshot, or those who might be uncomfortable with discussions, especially around prostitution, violent acts, especially those in relation to domestic violence. So now might be a good time to either move to another space or distract little ones, or perhaps just sign off and watch the program at a later time when you can see that on the Homestead's website. A big thank you to Jennifer for monitoring those Q&A and chat boxes. I do want to make our time together today feel as conversational as possible. So if you have a question at any time, please feel free to type those into the Q&A box here on Zoom, or you can type them into our Facebook page on Facebook Live if you're watching there, and she will track those and ask them for you during the course of the program. Also, I want to give a big thank you to Steve Dugan and Sherry Salmons, who helped me find a lot of the primary source material I needed to kind of piece this story together. For those who have been watching a lot of these female justice cases, you well know that women's history isn't often well-recorded history. There aren't a ton of books written. These cases are, though extremely well-known at the time, have not necessarily been the stories that have been retold throughout history. So that means oftentimes we have to go back to square one and find those primary sources to kind of piece everything together. And the two of them were immense help in getting that done. One last disclaimer before we begin. I'm not a lawyer, nor am I a legal historian. I do have a degree in history, and I have spent a tremendous amount of time researching legal cases that involve women because I feel it really helps to kind of provide an avenue into understanding how women lived in the past, especially women who were not necessarily middle or upper class, white, born in the United States, of specific orientations. So a lot of those stories have been lost. But we do occasionally get glimpses into what their lives might have been like through pretty extraordinary circumstances. And I think this case definitely exemplifies a pretty extraordinary circumstance. The story that I'm also going to share with you today kind of shines a light on a time period that might not be too familiar to a lot of us. It might have only been a time period that you kind of skimmed over in your high school history book. I'm talking about the Progressive Era, this period between the 1890s and the 1920s that was of really intense social and political change and reform. And I think it really does have a lot in common with what we're kind of seeing in our world today. So on that note, let's dive in. So what you see on screen right now is a death certificate for Lea Delmon. I'm going to kind of zoom in here so hopefully you guys can see it a little bit better on your screen at home. Now, note on the death certificate, it gives some pertinent information to who Lea was. He passed at 5'11 and a half North Main Street in Los Angeles. He was male, French, born in France. He was married, and he was about 38 years old at the time of his death. Now, he died on July 27th, 1913. And listed as the cause of death is a hemorrhage following gunshot wound of aorta. So basically, he was shot in the heart and bled out. Now, whenever there is a violent death on death certificates, they have to state what that cause might have been. Was it a suicide? Was it an accident? Or was it a homicide? So you can see pretty clearly here that the coroner wrote homicidal. Now, what's very unique, I think, about this particular death certificate is that the name of the murderer is also on the certificate. Scroll down here, you'll see in box number 14, it says Lea, actually it looks like they might have written Lena Dellman, also at 511 and a half North Main Street. And she was the one to attest to his information. Now, who was Lea? Lea was Louis's wife. And what really kind of intrigued me about her story was that at no time during the time that she was held by the police did she ever say his death was an accident. She completely fessed up, for lack of a better word, that she had killed him. She had murdered him, but she was never put on trial. Why? What made her story so different from anyone else who has ever committed a murder? Well, to answer that, I think we should go to the morning of the incident. So what you see on your screen now is a photograph for a building that is still standing in downtown Los Angeles. It's known as the Plaza House. If you've ever been to Overa Street in downtown LA, the Plaza area, so you'll see the Pico House. And so this building is right across the street from there. This building and the building next door actually make up the campus for what is known as La Plaza de Culturas y Artes. Sorry, my Spanish isn't so great. But it's a building that you can still go into today. And it was at this building on July 27th, 1913, that police were called at about 4 a.m. A neighbor had called saying that they heard a series of gunshots. And when they had come to the room where they believed the gunshots had been fired from, they broke in. And according to the Los Angeles Times, they reported this is what the police saw. They broke into a little room, fitted up with bookshelves and made home-like. They saw a man's figure on the bed and a horror-stricken woman imploring him to come back to life. This is also what the Times reported she said in those moments. I couldn't go back, Louis. I couldn't go back after fighting so hard to be good. Oh, come back to me, dear. Come back to me and help me to do right. Come back and help me to be somebody. Now, after the police took Lea from this building, they eventually took her to the matron's quarters at the city jail. And she began to tell officers what had happened that morning. And again, these are her words as they were reported in the LA Times. My husband came last night to my room. He has been coming only at intervals of late, and he wanted me to give up all this tiny room, and to go back to another life I had known. That other life that she's referencing is one of being a prostitute. I had given the man diamonds and automobiles. I had lavished love and money on him since I was a child of 16. But I had tasted of the joy of living right, and this one thing I refused him. We were in bed. He kicked me out and struck me. He threatened to kill me unless I consented. I begged, I pleaded with him. I told him I was ill, I could not do as he wished. He taunted me with the name of this Labarth woman. He said he would leave me and go with her. I was his wife, and yet he did all in his power to drive me wild. I seized a pistol and I told him that if he struck me again, I would shoot. He slapped my face. I began shooting. God, I don't know how many times. And that was all. Well, it was later reported that she did shoot a total of 5 times. As one newspaper put it, 1 bullet for each year of her unhappy married life. So now that you've heard this kind of intro part to the story, do you think she should be charged with murder? Jennifer's going to put up a poll right now to see what you think. So as you guys are answering this, I'm just going to kind of fill in a little bit of background information for you. So before charges can be brought, the district attorney has what's called a coroner's inquest. So they're going to determine during that inquest the cause of death and if there's really enough evidence to bring charges against the accused. So we're going to give just a couple more minutes or seconds there for people to vote. It seems like right now we're feeling like she should possibly be charged with murder. Others don't really know what to think. So it was at this coroner's inquest because she being the accused, she had to provide testimony to the circumstances. And she was actually, even though it's not a formal trial, there is an impaneled jury. In this case, there were 6 men that were impaneled to hear her story. And the inquest was actually held just about 2 days after the murder. It was held literally down the street from where it took place at the Button Undertaking Parlor. And it seems an interesting place to hold an inquest, but I guess he also served as the county coroner, so maybe it was just to kind of simplify things. So during the course of her testimony, it came out, it started to unfold how she met Lewis and how she became a prostitute. Now, it looks like pretty much everyone has voted at this time, and right now it looks like we're at about 48% think that, yes, she admitted to pulling the trigger, so therefore she should be tried. 13% say no, she didn't mean to do it, and 39% say, I don't really know what to think. So let's dive into her story a little bit more to see if that helps you kind of make up your mind. So Leah's story begins as a new immigrant. So the picture that you see on screen is one from the Los Angeles Herald, I believe. And it, as the newspaper said, has 2 photographs of Leah. The top picture is at the height of her beauty, and the bottom picture is a picture that was taken in her jail cell. So Leah was originally from Belgium. She had immigrated to the United States with her mother, and they had come to San Francisco in 1906. And as she said, they arrived just days before the great San Francisco earthquake and fire took place. Now, being a new immigrant, she didn't really know anyone. And she lost her mother during that event, so she had no one and nothing. And she said she met Louis a few days after, and that he told her he would take care of her. She stayed with him for a few days, and then he took her to a house and told her to do what the other girls are doing. She said that she knew it was bad, but that she was only between 15 and 16 years old, and that she just did as he told me, and I gave him my money. And this seemed to continue for a few years, until she said, one day I got very disgusted, and I told him we must stop that kind of life and be good. Then he took me to Salt Lake, and we were married. So I was able to actually find the marriage license for Louis and Leah. So I'm going to zoom in here so you guys can hopefully see that a little bit better on your screen. So you can see the state of Utah, County of Salt Lake. Louis Dellman, he's aged 33 years old in 1908. Miss Leah Courtier, that was her maiden name, aged 23. So she might not have quite been 15 or 16 years old in 1906, but she most likely was still a very young woman, only perhaps about 20 or 21 at the time. They were married on July 25th, 1908. Now, she said that when they got married, he was very good to me for a while, but he didn't get any work to do. And that soon after, he told me I had to go back to my old life and get money for him. I cried a long time, but I did so. He then moved them from Salt Lake City to Nebraska and then eventually to Denver. And here is the census I was able to find for Denver in 1910. I'm going to highlight her name here so it might be a little bit easier for people to see. There's that. I'll zoom in just a second. While I'm doing that, do we have any questions?
I think we're doing pretty well right now. Thanks, Jenny.
Okay, let me zoom in here. So hopefully you can see that a little bit better. So in the highlighted portion, you'll see Lea Delmon written there. She's listed as head of household. Louis is not on this particular census report for Denver. I actually found him in San Francisco's census. So it could have just been at the time. He wasn't, when the census was taken, he wasn't in Denver. But you can see that she is listed as married. She's been married for 2 years, so that adds up to our time frame. This is 1910. She was married in 1908. She also has another woman living with her, a Marie Lacoste or Lacrosse, who's listed as a lodger, who's also married. It shows that Leah had possibly immigrated to the United States in 1902. So when she was about 15 or 16 years old, and Marie had immigrated in 1901. They're both listed as French. Most likely this was just the census taker's account of her accent rather than getting an actual place of birth. And they are also listed as dressmakers. Now, in census reports, prostitutes are not going to be reported as prostitutes. So in some ways, this is kind of coded language when you're going through census reports. You might sometimes see women listed as dressmakers or seamstresses, or sometimes even like laundry washerwomen. That's not to say if you are doing some family genealogy and you come across a relative who's listed as a dressmaker, that they might have been a prostitute, but it might be worth a deeper search potentially. So Leah is living also in an area and kind of doing more research. She's living off of 21st Street in Denver. And this area is also kind of the heart of the red light district in Denver at the time. So putting these pieces together, it is more likely than not that she was still kind of plying her trade at that time. Now, they lived in Denver for just a short while. Louis then decided, you know what, let's go back to San Francisco. And while she lived in San Francisco earning a living for them, he actually stayed in San Jose at the home of his sister, Louise Pons. And she was only permitted to visit him once a week, usually for a day. And it was really to just turn over her earnings to him. And around 1911, they came to Los Angeles. And it was in Los Angeles that he, I guess, started to see a woman by the name of Louise LaBarthe. And during the coroner's inquest, Lea testifies to this and says that she confronted him about his relationship with her. And she said something that I thought was just struck me as pretty rough. I saw him with Louise LaBarthe. I felt awfully bad then because I loved him and I thought I had treated him all right. No mention of how he's been treating her, but how she has been treating him. When I asked him if he loved Louise, he said no and took me back to San Francisco. Now it seems that they only stayed in San Francisco again for a few months and then returned to LA, where they purchased a rooming house, the Plaza House, where he would eventually have his life taken. Now, I think Lea, as she testified, she really hoped that this purchase would be kind of a turning point for her life. She says, I told him we could live on what we got from that and I would be good. And he apparently had a different idea, according to her. She testified that he said to her in return, you won't work, he said to me. Yes, you will. You will be glad to when I get through with you. And then he proceeded to beat her. Now, at this time, after purchasing the boarding house, he tends to be away for longer periods of time. And she says that just the day prior to the morning of his murder, he had returned from an extended trip to San Diego. And he had asked her while he was gone, how much money did you make? And she said, nothing. I've been good. And then he proceeded to abuse her, and that's when she shot him. There was one other statement that I thought was kind of interesting that the coroner asked during the inquest. And he asked her, well, did you ever try to get away from him before? And I think this is something that often is asked, especially of abused women. Well, why didn't you try to get out? And this was her response. Yes, once. I saved some money and I hid it in a bag to go away with. He found the bag and beat me terribly for keeping money from him. So after she finished her testimony, the jurors were then, they took some time to decide on whether or not they felt charges should be filed against Lea. And apparently it only took a couple of minutes. And they decided that it was justifiable homicide. And when they were leaving Button Undertaking Parlors, they each in turn shook her hand, as was reported in the papers, for taking the action that she did. Now, the DA is kind of set now with this question. So he's going to take the testimony from the inquest. He isn't actually at the inquest because it isn't a formal trial. So he takes the testimony and he takes the recommendations of the jury. And because they determined it was a justifiable homicide, he now had to decide how he wanted to proceed. And the following day, he made a pretty extraordinary announcement. He said, it is possible the slain man had forfeited all consideration, even perhaps the right to live. But the DA wasn't ready to let her go just yet, because he really didn't want to set a precedent for people in a similar circumstance to do the same things. So what he decided instead was he was going to keep her in jail, and they were going to see what they could find out about Lea Delmon to see how well her story checked out. And that actually caused me to do a little digging of my own, because I was very curious as to what else I could find out about Louie that was kind of separate from her testimony. And I found some pretty interesting things, and I think the DA of Los Angeles also found some pretty interesting information about who Lea Delmon really was.
Jenny, you may be about to answer this question, but do we have any photos of Lea Delmon?
I could not find any. And this isn't unheard of. I would be surprised that there would have been any kept photos of Leah, even if this situation hadn't have happened. You know, we are all kind of holders of our own history. And as far as I know, Louise never gave any to the press to put into the papers. I haven't been able to come across any that identify him, unfortunately. I wish there was. If anybody finds any, let me know.
All right, thank you.
So the first bit of information I was able to find on Louis was actually from July 4th, 1907. So about a year before he and Leah got married. And it was from a newspaper in Washington State, the Spokane Review. And it had this article, "French Vagrant Goes to Jail." Let's zoom in so you can see a little bit better. Patrolman Lawson earlier this afternoon arrested Lea Delmon, a Frenchman, in a room in the main block, and they charged him with vagrancy. The man was beating Lena Davis, a habitué of the place, a prostitute of the place, who is said to give up her money to him. His bank book showed $1,425 deposited since April. For 1907, this is a ton of money. This is about the equivalent of almost $40,000 in today's money. And this was made from April to July when this incident took place. So he is dealing in a lot of money. He was eventually released. Being charged with vagrancy at that time was not uncommon. Men and women, especially in association with prostitution, were often cited with vagrancy or being immoral characters instead of actually, so it was a misdemeanor. It wasn't a felony. And also domestic violence at this time is not a felony. In California, it doesn't become a felony until the 1980s. Otherwise, it's a situation happening in a private home, and, you know, other avenues are often sought to dealing with that versus police involvement. Now, the next bit of information I was able to kind of dig up on Louis was from a Salt Lake City newspaper in February of 1909. So this is about 6 or 7 months after he and Leah had gotten married. I'm going to zoom in here so you guys can see that hopefully a little bit better. Lea Delmon wanted information regarding the whereabouts of Lea Delmon, a Frenchman about 33 years of age. So the name, the origin, as well as the age all kind of match up with the records that I know of. Will be gladly received by J.C. Heiss, inspector in charge of the United States Immigration Office in this city. Mr. Dellman is badly wanted, and should he communicate with Mr. Heiss, he will learn something greatly to his advantage. This may have also been the reason why Louis had decided they needed to leave Salt Lake and go to Nebraska. Now, it turns out, as I dug through some INS records, Immigration and Naturalization records, I found another kind of pretty interesting bit of information. I came across this card, and at the top there, you'll see it says immoral characters. And as I zoom in here, we see case number 1737, Lea Delmon. Regarding use of old law certificate of Germain Pons. Germain Pons was Louis's brother-in-law, husband to his sister, Louise. And this old law certificate was being used once again for immoral purposes. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find out too much more information on what those specifically were, but I did see in another newspaper mentioning in Denver that he was arrested in February of 1909 for importing Leah and another woman by the name of Dora Williams as prostitutes. Now, the most unusual thing about this case, I think, is that if it took place in any other time in history, I don't think the outcome would have been the same. Because what is kind of happening during this progressive era is really influencing how people feel about prostitution and red light districts and society's the impact on society. They're also really looking towards politics and the roles that politicians play in the continuing of vice. So in 1910, the Mann Act is passed. It's also known as the White Slave Traffic Act. And it made it finally a felony to transport any woman or girl for the purpose of prostitution or debauchery or for any other immoral purpose. So this is where we really first start to become concerned with what is happening to people's bodies and in human trafficking. Now, not everyone who unfortunately was convicted under the Mann Act had actually committed this offense. There are many stories in history. The most famous one of a person convicted under the Mann Act was a boxer by the name of Jack Johnson, where it's now really acknowledged that he was tried under the Mann Act because he was African American and he had taken up with a white woman, and because they had crossed state lines and had engaged in various activities, that he was then breaking this now federal law. But much was made of this because as the DA in Los Angeles is looking into the background of Louis Dellman, they're talking with immigration services, they're kind of piecing this puzzle together, and they really discover that it is quite possible that Louis was actually part of an entire group. He was connected with a large organization of, again, using the term of the day, white slavers. They even say that he was, just prior to his death, they had deported 3 women in Nebraska who were said to give him, or who paid him their earnings. So he wasn't exactly the nicest of men. Now, the DA, again, sitting with this information, had to kind of figure out, well, how is he going to acknowledge this pretty extraordinary circumstance that Leah is in? And also showing that he is kind of this idea of this new good government, which is kind of sweeping politics, which is looking to kind of push away all of the vice, the crime, you know, and to do what politics is actually meant to do, hopefully, which is to create a better and safer society for everyone to live in. And so he, again, didn't want people to think that they could do the same thing that she did. So he instead said, okay, we're releasing you from jail, which they did on August 15th. So about 2.5 weeks after the murder had taken place. But that she couldn't really leave town or anything because they might consider bringing charges against her at a later date. And she was also, interestingly, released into the home of this woman that you see on the screen. a Mrs. Charles Wellington Rand. She was a socialite of Los Angeles, very posh family. That's her on the right. Leah is in the middle, and Mrs. Rand's daughter Lillian is to the left of Leah. So why is a socialite interested in helping a woman like Leah? Well, much of that, again, I think, is because of the progressive movement. What's really happening at this time is that there is a huge interest by women in politics. We have the resurgence of women's voting rights and trying to gain those. Women are now starting to gain more of a political voice, and they're seeing what avenues they can actually contribute to create a better society. And the situation that Los Angeles was in, especially when it came to the red light district, was a pretty severe one. The map that you see on screen is from a book that was published by the LA County Bar Association. And it shows the areas around the plaza, again, just kind of outside of Olvera Street, if you've been to that area, for where prostitution was known to take place in the late 19th century, so the late 1880s, 1890s in Los Angeles. And prostitution there took many different forms, everything from street walking to cribs to bordellos, parlor houses. By 1897, it was so rampant that Sporting Guide, that's what they were called, was published in conjunction with the city's annual Fiesta de Los Angeles. That's kind of how comfortable, I guess you can say, or how well known it was, like not really a secret to anyone that this was all going on. So in the kind of boxed in area here around the plaza where you see Ferguson's Alley, Alameda, Arcadia, the plaza, that was kind of known as the crib district. And I'll go into what cribs were in just a second. Along Main Street, which is this kind of sad little highlight here on your screen. That's Main Street. That was the street that Leah was living on. That's where the rooming houses were. And this kind of provided like a step up from street walking in the cribs to these kind of independent places or occasional prostitutes would do business along these boarding houses. And then finally on the outside of that on New High Street in that kind of boxed in U shape, that is where a lot of the parlor houses were run from. Now, the most popular part of the crib district is this area here, kind of between Calle de los Negros and Alameda. This area was dubbed Hell's Half Acre. And it comprised, this section not only comprised of cribs, but also saloons, gambling houses. And it was all kind of run by this one guy that everybody knew about. He was published numerous times in the paper, and he was known as a crib king. His name was Bartolo Ballerino. He had come to California back during the gold rush and had pretty much run brothels as well as sporting houses, gambling halls, saloons with his wife and another business partner from about the 1850s until about 1910. So what is a crib? You might be wondering, because I was definitely wondering that because I didn't know what it was when I started into this. This is a crib. The image that you see here was actually printed in the LA Times in December of 1903. So cribs were a series of one-story brick buildings with very narrow rooms. And the women working in the cribs would often, when not applying their trade, be in the windows, like Ethel here. You might notice the names kind of written here on the doors. So we have Ethel on one side, Violet on the other. They could be in the doorways or out in front. And as the Times said, they were displaying their charms to as great an expanse as the benign laws and tolerant policemen of the day allowed. Well, this really got under the skin of a lot of people. Really kind of seeing this brazen selling of people. And so you end up with this kind of group kind of dubbed as like purity reformers that really in LA begin to push very, very hard in 1903 to clean up the crib district and to rescue these fallen women. Now, according to the article, the reformers had scattered about 300 women from this crib district, but yet another 150 remained. So this isn't a small number of people that are on a very forgotten part of society. So who were these purity reformers? Well, as one would imagine, a lot of them were religious leaders, but also a high number were women. Because again, women were finding these avenues to lend their voice to creating change. And organizers of women's clubs, like the Friday Morning Club, was one of the first to actually state that prostitution was a crime against women. And they helped to start places like the Door of Hope Rescue Home in LA, which sought to kind of train women in other fields, ranging from, household work to stenography, bookkeeping, even musical vocations, to really show that there was a possibility of this other life. So these people continued to try to clean up the crib district and then turn their eye towards the parlor houses. And these efforts continued for the next several years, from 1903 to 1909. Reformers in LA asked for the recall of LA's mayor, Arthur Harper, at the time. Harper, instead of being recalled, just resigns. And a good government reformer is installed in his place. His name was George Alexander, who takes Mayor Harper's place. And one of the first things Alexander does is he orders the new police chief to padlock all the known parlor houses, cribs, and brothels, and just orders the chief of police to rid the city of prostitution. And Leah herself said that, at the time, if she didn't go to jail, she wanted to help women like herself. But I thought this was kind of funny. She wanted to kind of still do it her own way. This is an article from July 31st from the LA Herald, in which she comments, "I don't want to be a crank reformer. I don't even want to be known in the work. By the same token, I am willing to be known as a woman who rose and fell and rose again, if it will be of benefit." Now, that's a pretty daring thing, especially during this time where women were one or the other. They were either saints or sinners. You didn't really have this middle ground in terms of how the female sex was viewed. So she was kind of a little bit ahead of her time in that she was willing to be known as long as it benefited other women. And perhaps her story did, but it also might have happened in ways that she wasn't completely aware of. While I was researching this case, I came across a really interesting advertisement for a play called The Traffic. Now, this was actually written by a woman, and in the advertisement, it has a message from LA's chief of police about his views on this particular story. Now, between 1909 and 1915, numerous plays and films, because the film industry is really getting going, are created to kind of raise awareness over this human sex trafficking. And this campaign decided to use Leah's story in a pretty interesting way. It says, the traffic is true to life. In my experience as a policeman, I have seen the play enacted in real life a score of times. Especially is this true among the foreign women who had been held prisoner in Los Angeles in the old days. Maybe not so much the old days. Then look at the case of Lea Delmon, who slew her husband rather than to be forced again to go through no worse horrors than those that are depicted in the traffic. So that's a pretty interesting kind of advertisement, I think, for play, to kind of show that true to life situation that's happening. Now, it seems, though, that for LA, for Los Angeles, these reforms only really lasted until about 1915. A new wave of city officials and leaders kind of come in, and they are a little less inclined to promote good government, and vice very quickly kind of rears its head again in the city. Which again is why I think if this incident had taken place before 1910, before the Mann Act, or after 1915, when the city wasn't as focused on these issues, the outcome of her story might have been very different. However, oh yeah, go ahead.
So sorry. We just had a comment. Well, it's a comment and a question, but it kind of goes with what you're saying. So Ruth had said, I'm happy that they let her go, but given you're not an attorney, and given that Louis is indisputably a piece of human garbage, and given that Lea did society a big favor, the question is still, can and should she really just kill him, sidestepping the trial process?
Well, exactly. You know, society is supposed to function, hopefully according to the letter of the law. And that is a very difficult thing to kind of determine. And I think that's what the DA was really wrestling with, because he definitely did not want to set a precedent that, you know, other women in this situation could just feel like, well, I'm just going to kill him. That's my only way out. But also we do have justifiable homicide as a legal reason for a reason. Because sometimes perhaps there are extraordinary circumstances that permit, you know, she fearing for her safety, feeling like this was the only situation. She testified and stated over and over again the fact that he had not just beat her once, but on numerous occasions during their time together. So that's also why we have juries. So, you know, it's often left up to that panel of 12 to determine how someone lives after an event like that. Do they go free? Do they spend time? I, knock on wood, I don't know how I would feel in a situation like that. So that's something I think that, you know, we can all kind of wrestle with as, you know, these stories continue to take place. That is my long-winded response, Ruth. So sorry for that.
No, that was great. We had another comment come in from Jim pointing out that her story actually fits, he said her story fits perfectly into Paul's series on vigilantism. So something that we have covered before.
Oh, absolutely. And, you know, Los Angeles isn't alone in vigilante justice. We often see vigilante justice throughout the course of American history. And it's very difficult to decide, you know, is something justifiable? Is it right to do? If the law won't take care of it, should others?
And we had another comment come in after that. It's Jim again saying that society has to be careful. Otherwise, it might be seen that a woman's bullet could be cheaper and easier than a divorce lawyer. Kind of pointing out the other part of that. And then Ruth, a comment from Ruth is saying that I guess I should be grateful she wasn't in front of a panel of 12 men and no women. And then we had a question come in from Sunny. So during this time, how many women would have been in, if there was a jury? Would there have been women on the jury?
Well, good question, Sunny. So in California, women actually got the right to vote, and this, you'll see where I'm going with this, in 1911. Now, which is years before 1920, and women gained the right nationally. After women gain the right to vote here, the next big push is women want to serve on juries. And they actually don't get to serve on a jury until about 1917, I believe. So no, it would have not necessarily been a jury of her peers, but just a jury of men. Some say men might be more sympathetic to her situation. That was actually written about quite a bit in papers. A lot was made of Mrs. Rand taking Leah into her home, saying that, you know, women are not often kind to members of their own gender, that we are often much more hard, and our expectations and our thresholds for what women should deal with is much higher than what men would think. So whether or not that's true, I don't know, but it was something that was discussed in 1913 in the papers, is that more women need to be more forgiving. This is such a great conversation. I'm so glad you guys got some good comments and thoughts.
All right, great. I think that's all of our comments for right now.
Okay. So the legal system wasn't quite done with Leah yet. Because her husband had passed, there was a question of what would happen to now his estate. So backtracking a little bit, while Leah was still in jail, Louis's sister, Louise, this is a drawing of Louise here, had filed with the probate court to become the administrator of his estate, which at the time was valued at around $10,000. This would be about $250,000 today. And she based this on the grounds that, one, she was his only blood relative, but also, two, that Leah shouldn't benefit from the estate because she was the cause of his death. So that was kind of her grounds for why she should have the right to the estate. Leah filed a counterclaim on the grounds that the estate comprised mainly of money she had earned, and that, to her knowledge, Louis had never earned any money himself. So I'm going to ask you guys, what do you think? Do you think Leah should have been provided with the estate of her husband, or do you think it should all go to Louise? Jennifer's going to put up another poll to see what you think. I'll give you just a couple of seconds here. Wow, people so far are feeling pretty strongly about Leah. So the question is, should Leah inherit her husband's estate? Yes, she earned the money, so it's rightfully hers. No, she killed him and shouldn't financially benefit from his death. or not sure, I can see both sides. We'll give just another couple of seconds.
We had another question pop in while we were doing that. So Craig and Ellen have asked, was Leah capable of considering all the other options to resolve her situation? So assuming that there's other options, you know, was she able to know like what else she had available?
Well, that's a very good question. For most women at this time, there aren't a lot of other options. There is divorce. Divorce is legal in California at this time. She could have sought a divorce. It would have been, I'm sure, probably pretty difficult. And she probably would have ended up with nothing because she's a prostitute. In terms of legal grounds, again, there aren't any domestic violence laws on the books right now. So the police really aren't going to help her. This is considered a private home matter. Again, laws aren't really passed in the United States that make domestic violence a felony until the 1980s. So she wasn't going to get a lot of benefits otherwise. And as she also testified, she tried to hide money and run away, but he found out and beat her. So I don't think she probably felt like she had a lot of other alternatives.
Okay, and Jim offered a comment on that. He says, she was his wife, so I think that takes precedence. In modern times California, we have the Slayer law that prohibits someone from benefiting from their crime, including insurance policies.
Yep, very, very true. So yeah, we definitely don't want people benefiting from murdering a spouse or someone who has named them as a benefactor to their estate. So that's definitely something, you know, even though I'm not aware of any law on the books at the time this happened, that is something that Louise' sister brought up, was like, this doesn't feel right. We shouldn't be saying that people could benefit in this way. So I think for the probate judge, he again was kind of faced with this like, whoa, what do I do? I don't want to set this precedent. So the decision on who got the estate actually took way longer than whether or not charges should be filed against her. So they were in probate court from early October of 1913, and that lasted until late May of 1914. Then it was finally determined that Leah would receive 3/4 of the estate, while the sister-in-law, Louise, would receive the remaining quarter. So that's how it ended up turning out, though you guys overwhelmingly looked like 92% felt like Leah should have definitely gotten the whole thing. So what did Leah do with the money? I was very interested in trying to see if I could kind of piece together what happened to her. And this is what I was able to find. So when the estate was finally settled, Leah had mentioned possibly returning to Belgium. She said she had a brother there that she could maybe go work for. But it looks like she made slightly different travel plans. What you see in front of you is actually her passport application from 1923. And you can see that it was actually made in the territory of Hawaii. She had moved to Hawaii at some point and had been living in Honolulu. So on this application, we can see where her place of birth was in Belgium. You know, she was born in 1885. So again, that kind of goes back to, she was probably about 20 or 21 when she met Louis. She was working as a housekeeper, she says, in Hawaii at this time, and that she was planning this trip to visit relatives in Belgium and also to go see France and Switzerland as recreation. So knowing she was planning this travel, I was able to start diving into ship's manifests to see if maybe I could see her name listed in the passenger log, to see if I can maybe get an address, because at the time they often would say where somebody was traveling from or to. And I was actually able to find this particular manifest for a ship sailing from Belgium to New York in 1924, in August 1924. It was the SS Zealand, and I'm going to highlight the name here so you guys can see that. Oopsie. My highlighting job's not the best. Sorry about that. There we go. We can see Leah's name listed here, Lea Delmon. She is a naturalized citizen by marriage. Louis had become a naturalized citizen back in the late 1890s. And her address in the United States is 1375 Britannia Street in Honolulu. And so, armed with an address, I wanted to see if I can figure out how long she had been in Honolulu. Did she only come in the 1920s? Had she been there earlier? And this is actually what I was able to find. Now, the name Lea Delmon starts to seemingly start to fall away. In the earliest city directory that I could find for someone living at that address that was close to her name, was this woman, Lea Delmon. So I'll zoom in here so you guys can see that. And the reason I think it may have been her is because we have, let me zoom in here, Lea Delmon, widow Lewis, living again at that 1375 Britannia address. So Lea Delmon appears in the city directory for this address from 1918 to about 1921 or so. And then beginning in 1922, a slightly different name starts to appear at that address. So I'm going to pull up the 1923 city directory for Honolulu, again at that address. Let me highlight here. Where I start to see more commonly this name, Lea Delmon, widow Lewis. So I started to focus more on that name. Now, again, I cannot say definitively this is Lea Delmon. My gut reaction is that it is, but that's just my opinion. Now, going through newspaper records and things like that, I see this name Lea Delmon pop up a handful of times, buying property, doing some business deals. Always on ships manifests, I see Lea Delmon, but on census reports and other things, it's shifting more towards this Lea Delmon. So the last time I have been able to find the name Lea Delmon is actually in the 1940 census for Hawaii, for Honolulu. And it is unfortunately for the Territorial Hospital for Mental Diseases. So it is an insane asylum. And she is listed there. I'm going to highlight her name down here, so hopefully you guys can see that. It's the worst highlighting job, sorry. I'm going to zoom in so you can see. So she's listed third from the bottom, Lea Delmon, as a patient. And again, another reason why I think it might have been her, we have the birthplace being Belgium. And unfortunately, that is the last I could find on Leah. Hopefully, maybe she'll appear in the 1950 census, but that will not be made public until 2022. So I've got 2 more years to wait and see. There's a 72-year rule for censuses to become public, go into the public domain. So then I'll be able to see if maybe she is still living in the asylum in Hawaii, or she may have met her end there. But that does also take us to the end of the program and my stories that I have for Leah today. Thank you so very much for joining me. We do have lots of other upcoming programs here at the Homestead. You can sign up for any of those. They're all online. We have our fiction book club, our summer series, and then it got worse. The next book they're going to be talking about on August 19th is Ghost Talkers. On August 23rd, please come back and join me. I'm going to be with a panel of very interesting women who have been doing a lot of research exploring the places and spaces in LA that lent to women's rights movements across from the 1850s through the 1980s and all of the things that go into that. So that will be a very fun panel. You can sign up for that now on our website. It'll again be a Zoom talk. On Sunday, September 13th, we have an early history of California winemaking. Robert Barron, who is our facilities coordinator, as well as our resident sommelier, will be talking about the history of California wine. On September 25th is our nonfiction book club. Suffrage and women's rights is the theme for that particular one. It is August, so it is the 100th anniversary of the women's rights movement and gaining the Voting Rights Act. And finally, on September 27th, Paul Spitzeri, the museum director, will be talking, picking up from his last talk on the workmen and temple families in Los Angeles, life during wartime and the Mexican-American War and how the families were involved in that. So again, thank you so much for joining me. If you have any questions, anything comes to mind later, shoot me an email. You can, it's up there on your screen at g.trulock@homesteadmuseum.org. Also, you can follow us on social media. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram at Homestead Museum. Also, we have a blog. So we regularly are sharing lots of interesting stories of Los Angeles history there. And you can also check out the museum website at any time at homesteadmuseum.org. Any final thoughts or questions?
Yeah, we have a couple of questions and comments that have come in. So Jim has made a comment, kind of a question, but he said prostitution. There's no mention of children, but I guess that brings up another conversational topic. So
Absolutely.
Jim. A comment from Number is in the films of 1913, there's a film called Traffic in the Souls, and this person says it's on DVD.
Yeah, you can also find a number of them on YouTube. Kind of some pieces, some are full films, but yeah, it was really, again, a very popular theme for plays and films from 1909 to about 1915.
Great. So Ruth says this was great. Thank you.
Thanks,
Michael also says excellent presentation.
Thanks,
Denise says, thank you. I'm always surprised how women had little rights for themselves. We've come a long way in 100 years.
Absolutely. And that's why, you know, from the Seneca Falls to, you know, the finally national passage in 1920, there was generations of women just wanting to gain this voice, mainly because they knew that they were forgotten in the laws that were passed.
Great. Janice, comment from Janice says, first time I've joined the Workman Temple Museum presentation. Very interesting and very well done. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Janice, so glad. Hopefully you'll join us for others.
We have a couple of others saying, Monica, another excellent presentation. Thank you. Jim Crabtree says, applause, applause. Ruth is, I think, commenting back on the coming a long way in 100 years and says, sadly, no, we really haven't. Commenting on, things that are still to be done. We have Rena is saying, thank you very much. An excellent talk and a great use of Zoom features. So thanks for your highlighting. I think some folks liked that. And I'm going to point out one last thing that didn't show up on our coming up events. This is part of our Female Justice series, and we have 4 of these programs that have happened or that will happen this year. So we have gone through our first 3, but we still have 1 more. Come back in October for that also. We don't have signups for that yet, but if you think this is interesting, you will probably like the Trial of the Tiger Lady. So that is still on its way.
That's an interesting case. Very interesting case. Clara Phillips, 1920s. Yeah. She did it all for mothered love, she says.
So we'll tempt you all on that. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. It was great to see you here. Once again, if you have any questions, you are welcome to send Jenny an email at g.truelock@homesteadmuseum.org, or you can send me an email at j.shara@homesteadmuseum.org. You can sign up for those other events that Jenny was talking about that are on our list here. They are all available right now on our website. All of these events are virtual events, so we hope that you'll join us again on Zoom. If you joined us today on Zoom, you are going to be receiving an evaluation for this program via email. We would love it if you would respond to that. It really helps us to plan for the future and just to know, what's working and what can we change for the future. If you were watching on Facebook Live, we're going to be posting a link to the evaluation in the comment box. So you can just go ahead and click on that there and get us some of that same feedback again. So once again, thank you for your help, and thanks for being here today, and we hope to see you again at another event.
Thanks so much, guys. Have a good afternoon.
Have a good afternoon, everyone.